You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. My guest is Katie Hasson. She's a PhD. She writes, speaks, researches, and teaches about the social and political aspects of human genetic and reproductive technologies. She's part of the Center for Genetics in Society, and we're going to be talking about a lot of thorny but interesting issues. Katie, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, tell me what's your work about? What are you focused on?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about the Center for Genetics in Society. We're a public interest nonprofit. We're based in Berkeley, California, and what we're focused on is trying to encourage responsible uses and effective governance of human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies. And within that, a main focus that we have is trying to bring a social justice perspective to public conversations around human biotechnologies. And here I'm the program director on genetic justice. My main focus is in our work around human gene editing and really focused on how we can bring more perspectives and more voices into the really urgent conversations that we need to be having as a society about how we want to use a powerful biotechnology like human gene editing.
So what is the justice part of it? Well, I guess first, how is it being used today? What's the fears around the use in the near future? Let's start with that.
Yeah. So there's been conversations about how we should use human gene editing that have gone on for a long time, right? Really since, the early 2000s, back when the conversation was more around human cloning. But in the past few years, with the emergence of CRISPR and the different ways of using CRISPR gene editing, these conversations have really gotten much more prevalent and much more important. And there are a range of ways that CRISPR and other forms of gene editing can be used on humans. And I think there's a really important distinction to make right off the bat, which is about whether we're talking about using gene editing in somatic cells, right, in the body of an actual patient to attempt to treat or perhaps cure an illness that they have. But this would be something that affects the cells in their bodies, but is not passed on to future generations. So we call that somatic gene editing or gene therapy. And the distinction is between that and germline gene editing, which is using CRISPR, another gene editing tool, on sperm or eggs or early embryos in a way that would make changes that would be throughout every cell in that person's body and also pass on to future generations. So on the one hand, for gene therapies, we're talking about developing treatments for actual patients, and germline gene editing, we're talking about affecting the genetic makeup or perhaps the traits of future people, future generations. And that's something that for a long time, many people have believed should really be a bright line that we don't cross with how we use these technologies. But probably you and your listeners have heard in November of last year, there was an announcement by a scientist in China, Hasson, who announced that there had been the birth of 2 babies whose genes had been edited in the embryo stage, right? So this was the announcement of the first CRISPR babies or genetically edited babies. And this has really, intensified and sped up the conversations that we need to have about how we'll be using these technologies. Some of the concerns are, there are a number of technical and safety concerns. This is pretty new research, and I don't think really any scientists agree that it's the right time to move forward with using this in human beings. There are just too many unknowns. We know about some of the ways that it can go wrong. CRISPR can make off-target cuts. It can make changes where it's not supposed to, or it can make the wrong kinds of changes at the target site. There are cases where not all of the cells are edited, so that the resulting person would have a mix of cells that are edited and not edited, and we don't know, what the effects of that would be on their health. And really, we don't know in a lot of ways what the effects would be once a baby is born, as they grow up, as they grow older, as this moves into the next generation. And it's not clear that there's really an ethical way that we can find out, right? How could we really say that we know that this is safe and ready to be used in people? But beyond those safety concerns, there are a lot of social concerns. And that's the kind of thing that, we are most concerned about here.
What's an example of some social concerns?
Yeah, I think, when we think about the proponents, people who want to go ahead with using germline gene editing, the conversation is often around preventing disease, right? Preventing genetic diseases from being passed on to future generations. And one of the things that's frustrating about that conversation is that it often doesn't include a lot the alternatives that already exist. Many people support the goal of, for parents who know that they're at risk of passing on a genetic disease to their offspring, many people support helping them prevent that from happening. But we actually already have safe and effective ways of doing that when that seems like an appropriate goal, particularly through embryo screening or a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where parents could use IVF and screen the IVF embryos that they have and choose to only implant those that are not affected by the disorder that they're concerned about passing on. And that's something that would be effective in the vast majority of cases, although there are some where it wouldn't happen. But so when we're talking about the benefits and harms, it's important to think about the alternatives that are already available.
So, okay. What are some of the ethical considerations? So people say they want to, they want to eradicate these diseases that could be inherited, but I don't know, what are other reasons for people to do what they want to do?
Yeah, even that basic question isn't entirely free of ethical concerns, especially if we look at it from a disability rights perspective. There are many people, disabled people in the disability rights community who argue that the disability actually comes from the way that society treats people with a variety of embodiments, and that we shouldn't necessarily assume that all of these things need to be fixed. Many people think of a disability as part of their identity, even. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind, even when we're talking about screening or PGD. But a level of societal concern comes in when we think about who's going to make decisions about how these technologies can be used, right? There's not agreement across the board on, what counts as a serious disease, or where we would draw the line between something that was seen as having a therapeutic aim or something that is seen as designed to enhance the future person, right? And so there's not full agreement on that, and it brings up the question of how we would decide, how this would be used in the future. And there really are a number of risks of these technologies if germline gene editing were to be used in reproductive contexts, right, to change future generations, that it would exacerbate the kinds of social inequalities that we already have in our society, that are already, quite vast. We have to think about how we want to, do we want to embark on the use of this new technology that could make those inequalities even worse, right? By allowing those with wealth to have access to purported enhancements, right? Even if it's not possible to produce the kinds of genetic enhancements of intelligence or appearance or athletics that often get talked about when the idea of designer babies is brought up, right? Even if it's not possible to make those kinds of changes genetically, the idea that you could, right? It's very likely that clinics would advertise these forms of enhancement to parents, and parents who had attempted to have these edits made to their children would perhaps see their children differently. Educators might see them differently, right? The perception that there was some kind of enhancement and the belief that some people in society would be genetically enhanced can be very damaging. That we can see that from, the history of racism and of eugenics in our society that are based around this basic belief that there are forms of biological superiority.
Well, okay. Is the concern more to get therapies into people's hands, or is the concern to limit the possibility of people being enhanced? What if the therapy is both?
Well, therapies that would be for patients, but these kinds of somatic gene therapies are something that most people support, right? The idea of stopping germline gene editing is not to stop any forms of therapies in terms of somatic gene therapies. I think many people support that going ahead as long as there's, full attention paid to making sure that they're safe and they're effective and that they're accessible to people, right? The gene therapies that already exist are astoundingly expensive, and so there has to be some thought put into how those will be paid for and how we can make sure that everyone who needs them has access to them. And the question of enhancement definitely will come into play with those somatic gene therapies, and that's something that probably needs to be discussed more, right? How are we going to make sure that these therapies are developed and decide which uses will be allowed and which won't? But I think because, we're talking in that case about only that individual and the risks and benefits that might come to that person, it's a very different question than whether we're going to allow people to, alter the genes of future generations and in ways that could be, passed on.
Say someone, I'm going to put it bluntly, a couple can't get pregnant. So the only way to help them is, this one therapy that would change not just their somatic cells, but it would change their germline cells, the egg or the sperm, in order to allow them to have a baby, which is fine for that instance. But then going forward, every time they have a baby, they would be able to, I guess I don't know what would be the conundrum on doing that.
I think the conundrum is partly about, making these changes with unknown effects that could be passed down, right? We won't know what the risks may turn out to be in those future generations. And I think, there's.
I guess there's two kinds. Let's say you can tell that the child you're going to have is going to have Down syndrome, so you alter them so that they're quote unquote, I guess, back to normal. Versus the child. I don't know. I guess if you restore things back to their normal state, that's one thing. But if you change things that affect the normal state, so it's different from the normal state, there it seems like there'd be a lot more of a question of, we changed this, but how does it affect everything else versus just fixing an obvious defect, you could say.
Well, I think that, there are, I would not take that as an assumption. I think that it is a part of normal variation for someone to have Down syndrome or to have a number of different kinds of embodiments. And, when you start talking about just putting only returning things to what's normal, I mean, that there's a lot of assumptions that go into, saying what is normal. And, it comes back to this question of, one, who decides that, especially when there is such broad disagreement. I mean, there are many people with a range of disabilities who, feel that this really would increase discrimination against them in society to say that it should just be edited out, the condition that they have and that makes up an important part of who they are. But also, it sounds easier on the face of it to say, well, these kinds of interventions would be therapeutic and these would be enhancement. But it gets much trickier when you start to drill down into what that would look like. Whereas the line between, somatic therapies that only affect that one person and germline that affects future generations is an easier line to draw. But, when you talk about, correcting disease, it opens up the question of what about something like prevention, or what about something that would reduce someone's likelihood of getting a disease by a certain percentage? Can we call that purely therapy? Can we call that enhancement? And how are we going to make enforceable policy around a slippery distinction like that?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, all medicine itself, if I help someone with a condition they have, why could you say that's enhancement? If someone has a cold, you could say that's natural, and I gave them something to cure them of the cold. So are they enhanced? And is that unjust that I help them?
I mean, I think that's, one kind of question, but I think it becomes different when you're talking about, altering DNA.
If you have cystic fibrosis.
It moves it into a different kind of category than, the example of eyeglasses that improve people's vision, or something like that.
Maybe. I mean, I guess you could say anything, could be like that. Why should they be allowed to have eyeglasses and have enhanced vision when other people don't have them? But I know there's going way far afield, and then there's stuff that's more obvious. So I understand there's going to be questions around a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But if someone has a condition where the average lifespan of them is going to be a third of what would normally happen, or what's average, and they'd be in horrible pain and have disability, well, maybe that seems like more of an obvious thing. Maybe cystic fibrosis, there's really no argument on it. It's, seems to be a horrible condition. I don't know if there's anyone that would want to keep it. So, but there are questions around all this stuff. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think, sort of pushing to make a list of what wouldn't.
You're going to have to, yeah? Someone's going to have to, it sounds like.
Well, I mean, but I think there is a choice that we could say, let's focus on somatic therapies for people, who are here and who have illnesses that would like to be treated. Let's, if we decide it's appropriate, let's use the kinds of screening that we have, like PGD with IVF, when parents know that they're at risk of passing something on to their children. But let's not move into intervening in the germline.
Do you think it's even controllable? Or is this just, we'd like to control it, but I don't know if it's even possible. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's controllable?
I mean, I don't think that it's, we can't throw our hands up and say it's inevitable, it's going to happen anyway. I mean, right. There are many countries that already have legislation that say that germline gene editing should be prohibited. And it's having more international cooperation and laws would really go a long way towards having a clear stance out there, right? I mean, even having laws prohibiting germline gene editing everywhere would not stop every case of it happening, right? I mean, that's unrealistic, but having the law sends a clear message about, what we think should and should not be allowed, and, can have penalties attached to it for people who violate it. So it couldn't be stopped in 100% of cases. I mean, we've already seen that that's true, but it's not the case then that we, could not collectively decide to have legislation about it, right? We have laws for many things that do get broken, but we don't get rid of or say that there's no point in having laws about it.
Right. I gotcha.
Yeah.
So you think a good line initially would be somatic versus germline alterations?
Yeah. I think that is the one that's, conceptually and practically the easiest one to hold. And somatic gene therapies do offer a lot of promise, so it's good to keep that exploration going.
Okay, gotcha. So I don't know, is there an international organization that's going to make these rules? It sounds like there should be one, if you want it to be all around the world. So what's happening worldwide? Are bodies forming, or who's running them, or what's kind of the state of the...
Yeah, there are, as I said, there are a number of countries where on the national level they've made legislation. And there is at least one international treaty called the Oviedo Convention. It's from the Council of Europe. And at least 29 countries have ratified that. And it says that germline gene editing for reproduction is prohibited. And then there are a number of international efforts to talk about how this should be regulated. There's a panel that's meeting through the World Health Organization currently, and there's an international commission hosted jointly by the National Academy of Sciences in the US and the Royal Society in the UK that's pulled together members from a number of countries to think about what a framework for using germline gene editing might look like if society decides that it should go forward. The WHO panel is looking more broadly at what should be done. So those are two efforts that are going on. But we would really like to see an even broader conversation. I mean, this is something that we're talking about that could potentially affect everybody, right? If we're talking about altering the human genome in future generations in ways that would be passed down and become a part of sort of the general gene pool, then it's something that affects all humans, basically, all of us. And so it would really be something that, there should be a way for the broadest possible conversation to happen, to bring more people in, more voices. So far, the conversations are mainly happening among, elite scientists, bioethics professionals, sometimes broader groups of academics, but we'd really like to see more of a public conversation happening, and in particular, one that brings in voices from civil society, like groups that are already thinking and talking and working on issues of discrimination in our society and ways to repair it will have a particular unique perspective on these questions, and I think should be brought into the conversation as well.
Well, voices and talks and again, is this just in the U.S. or is this worldwide? And what's the focus here? First here and then worldwide. I mean, we can rule on X, Y, and Z, but if other countries don't rule the same, then what?
Right.
So how would you make this a phenomenon that actually would be enforceable?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it really does need to be worldwide, which will obviously be a challenge, but it's an important enough question that we should sort of put the time and creativity into thinking about how we could make it happen. But a number of scientists and organizations have already been calling for a worldwide moratorium on reproductive uses of germline gene editing. So the idea that we say, let's stop for now so that we have time to have these conversations in a really thorough, broad way, right? So we can figure out how we can bring in people around the world, how we can make sure that there's international cooperation in these rules. But if scientists are racing to move ahead, we lose time to have that conversation. Whereas saying let's stop for now while we decide really gives more space and time for that to take place. Right? It is a complicated question how we will come up with a way that is actually worldwide and cooperative and enforceable. But we'll need some time to think about it, to work it out.
What's the path there that you see? What are the steps right now that you guys are taking to try to get this moving?
Yeah, I mean, we are one of the things that we do is we work with other organizations. We work with reproductive justice organizations, disability rights, LGBTQ, environmental groups, and a number of others to sort of bring this issue to them and kind of bring their perspectives more to the public. We are interested in things like the U.S. Senate resolution that was introduced earlier this year that called for broad public debate and at least was bringing the attention of the Senate and of our elected leaders to this issue in a way that encourages international cooperation and broad conversation in the public. So those are two promising things. We would like to see the efforts that are already underway, like the WHO and the National Academy of Science groups, to have a more kind of robust public conversation around that as well.
For listeners, how can they get involved in the conversation and how can they find out more?
Yeah, our website, geneticsandsociety.org, has a lot of information. We, follow the news very closely and we post a lot of news. We have writing on our blog, which is called Biopolitical Times. You can also follow us on Twitter at @C_G_S, and you can find us on Facebook as well. You can also join our email list and get our monthly newsletter.
Okay, excellent. So best is go to the website or go on social media, and then in the show notes, we'll put details about the meeting that's coming up in a few weeks. And excellent. Well, Katie, Thank you for coming.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the conversation.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.